Okay, everybody. So last week was lesson 10 in the Wiersbe book. And there we looked at Leviticus 24. That was an interesting chapter because it talked about caring for that tabernacle's lamp and preparing the sanctuary bread. Such simple things with such deep meaning in them and implications for the New Testament. They also talked about it looked kind of different, but it was about God's holiness in enumerating the punishment for blasphemy. Blasphemy. You shall not use the Lord's name in vain. And emphasizing justice and proportional retribution, eye for an eye. The implication wasn't there that you always have to put out the other guy's eye if he puts your eye out. The implication was more, let's be tolerant in how we respond. Let's have, if he knocks out one of your teeth, you don't knock out one of three of his teeth, proportionate. Like, well, this week, Israel's response, Israel's retaliation to Iran was proportional, not retribution. So that is kind of what God had in mind. This week, in lesson 11, we're going to cover the 25th chapter of Leviticus, just one chapter this week, and it's going to provide an analysis of the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. You see, every seventh year, rather, God required the Jews to rest the land. That was called the Sabbath year. Every 50th year, they had to restore property and people. That's the year Jubilee, it's called. And they did that because God wanted to emphasize his grace, because he wanted to ensure that no one remained permanently enslaved in this world or impoverished, at least if he was a Jew at that point. As we drill into this a little bit more and get an overview for today, I know a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the calendar and all the different festivals. And so we briefly touched on these two, the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. And now we're going to give it a lot more detail. And the focus on this chapter and in fact on next week's chapter is about the land. The word land occurs 39 times in this chapter and next week's. And then the statement in verse 2 of chapter 25, it says, when you enter the land I am going to give you, sets the tone for the whole chapter today. And if you think about it, it must have really been a great encouragement for Moses to hear those words, because we are at Mount Sinai, right? God's giving Moses the law. It's not really been that long since they were in Egypt, and we've been sitting here in Mount Sinai for a while, with the camp encamped around it. If you look at the context of where we are, and Moses would have really been encouraged, as well as the people, to hear God didn't say, if you enter the land, it says, when you enter the land I'm giving you. So, given that God was going to give them the land to possess and enjoy, they had to recognize and respect some basic facts about this proposition. The first was that God didn't really give them the land. God owned the land. And he didn't say that now you own the land and I don't. God still owned the land and had every right to dispose of it as he saw fit. God also owned the people of Israel, because he had redeemed them from Egyptian bondage. And because they belonged to him, all Jews were to treat one another like their owner God wanted them to, and he wanted to treat them as brothers and sisters and not take advantage of each other regarding things like personal debts or property claims. And we'll see that God put commanded that they use a system that would guarantee that, and that's this year of Jubilee and the year of the Sabbath. These Jews had to toil in their fields, right? But God's the one who supplied them with the sunshine and the rain and the harvest. In other words, the people of Israel had God as their land Lord. He was their Lord, and it was his land. And they had to live by faith in his word. They just had to live by faith. And this was probably the most important thing they would get out of it, just having that faith. Well, by doing that meant they had to obey his commandments and trust his promises. Another thing that's important that emerges from this chapter is that God controlled the calendar. God gave his people their land, their food, and their special times to observe, so that the land wouldn't degrade and spoil. He didn't want them ruining his land. He was concerned about ecology and about the way we treat his creation. He's very concerned about that. And from this very beginning, he shows he was. Just like those ancient Jews, we are simply stewards of God's gifts. We don't own the land. We might think we do, but we don't. We've got to be careful not to abuse this world or waste resources. Now, had these Israelites obeyed these principles, their economic system would have functioned smoothly. The land would have provided all they needed, and everybody would have had adequate care. However, we'll learn in later books of the Bible that they didn't obey the Lord. And as a result, progressively, things got worse. The rich got richer, the poor became poor, and the land just fell into ruin by the end. But that's in the future. Let's look at how God planned it, though. Let's look at the Sabbath year. Look at Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 7, and then 18 through 22. Thank you, Ida, for reading.
You're welcome. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, the Lord said to him, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you have entered the land I am giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every 7th year. For 6 years you may plant your fields and prune your vineyards and harvest your crops. But during the 7th year, the land must have a Sabbath year of complete rest. It is the Lord's Sabbath. Do not plant your fields or prune your vineyards during that year. And don't store away the crops that grow on their own, or gather the grapes from your unpruned vines. The land must have a year of complete rest, but you may eat whatever the land produces on its own during its Sabbath. This applies to you, your male and female servants, your hired workers, and the temporary residents who live with you. Your livestock and the wild animals in your land will also be allowed to eat what the land produces. If you want to live securely in the land, follow my decrees and obey my regulations. Then the land will yield large crops, and you will eat your fill and live securely in it. But you might ask, what will we eat during the 7th year, since we are not allowed to plant or harvest crops that year? Be assured that I will send my blessing for you in the 6th year, so the land will produce a crop large enough for 3 years. When you plant your fields in the 8th year, you will still be eating from the large crop of the 6th year. In fact, you will still be eating from that large crop when the new crop is harvested in the 9th year.
Oh, no worries there. There's going to be plenty. Well, last lesson or 2 lessons ago, I guess last lesson, we learned about the Sabbath year and a time which was, as I mentioned, there was a time of rest every 7th year for the people, the land, and the animals. And just as it was a day of rest, the 7th year was meant for the land to lie fallow. So just like every 7th day, we're supposed to rest, at least that was the old covenant. Every 7th year, the land got its chance to lie fallow. The people could only gather food and that naturally grew from the fields. They couldn't till the land or do anything to it. It was to let it, take a break, recover. It was also a time of social and economic reset. So it wasn't just the land, it was also social and economic rest. Deuteronomy 15, if you read there, it gives more detail into this than in the second telling of all these laws. And it explains that the lenders forgave debts, indentured servants went free, and this practice, therefore, it would what? It would foster the people to be generous and be motivated by gratitude of God's blessings to them rather than just greed. And it says, okay, let's take a reset, because every 7th year we're going to forgive all our debts and let those servants go free. So every 7th year, during that special 7th year, the people trusted God for their food. They didn't plant, but they were going to have food. It was what a test of faith. And God promised to provide for them if they trusted him. It was also a time for spiritual renewal. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't just land renewal, it was spiritual, because it was marked by a special reading of the book of Deuteronomy to remind the people of God's laws and promises. So by Deuteronomy, Wiersbe means the law. This reading occurred during the annual Feast of Tabernacles. Despite the benefits of the Sabbath year, well, maybe I should save this till the end, but the sad thing is that there's no biblical record that the Israelites consistently observed it. They didn't do it. In fact, 2 Chronicles 36:21 suggests that they neglected it for nearly 500 years until their exile, when the land was finally given a rest. So where do we get that conclusion? In 2 Chronicles 36, verse 2, it briefly says, so the message of the Lord was spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the 70 years were fulfilled, just as the prophet had said. Well, where do you get 500 from that? Well, 70 years, if each year represented finally resting on a Sabbath year, that would be 70 Sabbath years, and they occurred every 7th year. So that would be 70 times 7, or 490 Sabbath years, which is close to 500. So you can deduce from that verse that they must not have celebrated 500 times. Yes. Anyway, the lesson from the Sabbath year was that disobeying God's commands can lead to loss, not only of material blessings, but also of spiritual enrichment. Because by working the land continuously, what were they doing? They were wearing out the land and forfeiting the blessings that came from trusting in God. That's the bigger thing. They didn't have that opportunity to trust God by a land fast, by not doing anything with the land, by intentionally not putting out a crop for that year, they were trusting God, putting a lot of faith and growing spiritually. Let's look at the next section, which is release and separation. And this is about the release and restoration, the year of Jubilee. And you probably heard a lot of Jubilee. Well, let's study it in more detail now. That's Leviticus 25, 8 through 17. So the gap we skipped a little while ago, and then 23 through 24.
In addition, you must count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 sets of 7 years, adding up to 49 years in all. Then on the Day of Atonement, in the 50th year, blow the ram's horn loud and long throughout the land. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live there. It will be a jubilee year for you, when each of you may return to your land that belonged to your ancestors and return to your own clan. This 50th year will be a jubilee for you. During the year, you must not plant your fields or store away any of the crops that grow on their own, and don't gather the grapes from your unpruned vines. It will be a jubilee year for you, and you must keep it holy. But you may eat whatever the land produces on its own. In the year of Jubilee, each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors. When you make an agreement with your neighbor to buy or sell property, you must not take advantage of each other. When you buy land from your neighbor, the price you pay must be based on the number of years since the last Jubilee. The seller must set the price by taking into account the number of years remaining until the next year of Jubilee. The more years until the next Jubilee, the higher the price. The fewer the years, the lower the price. After all, the person selling the land is actually selling you a certain number of harvests. Show your fear of God by not taking advantage of each other. I am the Lord your God. The land must never be sold on a permanent basis, for the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and tenant farmers working for me. With every purchase of land, you must grant the seller the right to buy it back.
All right. Well, this is an economic system that it's got some very, if I think an economist would love thinking through what would such a world be like, what would such an economic system be like, because it's so different from anything we've ever experienced. The idea that the land, every 50th year, the land's worth nothing, right? The day before the year of Jubilee, the land's practically worthless, because if you buy it for a high price, the next day it's no longer yours anymore. You give it back to the owner. Yeah. But if you buy it the day after Jubilee, then it's worth 50 years worth of use. So the really, really interesting system. I like to think through what does that mean? At least I find it that way, maybe as an engineer. Well, let's start at the beginning, basics. The word Jubilee appears 6 times in this chapter, and just in those verses I read. What's it mean? It means probably not what you think it means or what we think it means today. It meant to sound the trumpet. That's it. You see, for Israel, as we went through when we were talking about the calendar a couple of weeks ago, each new year began with the blowing of trumpets on the first day of the 7th month, followed by the Day of Atonement. So every year, they're going to blow those trumpets on the first day of the year. It's kind of like fireworks going off on on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve. And then the next day, when they wake up, it's the Day of Atonement. And that is not a time to have New Year's parties or anything. It's a time of fasting, repentance, and sacrifices to say, forgive me, Lord, for my sins. That's what the deal was. Now, every 50th year, the day after that, it was the trumpets again. So we've got the trumpets, and then we've got, double-barreled trumpets going on in the year of Jubilee. So on this next day, the trumpets sound again, announcing the year of Jubilee, which was to be a time of rest, release, and restoration, as we read. This Jubilee year required them to have even greater faith than a Sabbath year, because it was always the way the calendar lined up, it was always right after a Sabbath year. So you have the Sabbath year when they didn't plant crops. The very next year was the year of Jubilee when they didn't plant crops. So you have 2 years in a row where they don't plant crops, and they're depending on God for everything. They're saying, God, you're going to get us through. It's not like the 7 years in the land of Egypt, but it's a really trusting time if you're going to do it for God. Though God's faithfulness was sure, Israel's faith sometimes, usually faltered, because, again, to spill the beans here, there's no evidence that they ever celebrated the year of Jubilee. I still like to think through it, because it's what God had planned, and it's such a cool idea to me. Anyway, they did celebrate and obey some aspects of these laws that we're going to read, though. Otherwise, as you'll see, the line of Jesus would not have included Ruth in it. The year of Jubilee, what's it got? It's got 4 key elements that I just read. One is repentance. So the year, like I said, began with the Day of Atonement, somber period, national repentance. The people were supposed to, on that day, seek forgiveness before God, ensuring that their hearts were right with Him. Make sure that this coming year, for a regular, normal year, it happened every year, this Day of Atonement. It was to make sure you were right with God beginning of the year. Only then would you be prepared for the coming year. But in the year of Jubilee, it also made sure you were of the right mindset and frame of mind, and humbled to trust God enough to release your slaves and restore the land you have to its original owners. So that was as a segue to the next thing, which was not only was a day of repentance, but it was a day of release, or a year of release. The people had to release all their indentured servants, you might call them slaves, so they could return to their families and their lands. The Hebrew servant served for 6 years and then became free in the 7th year. That's the way things worked. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't sell yourself forever to somebody. You always got freed up in that 7th year. So the best you could do is rent yourself out to somebody for a certain number of years and say, okay, kind of like a professional football player. Okay, I'm going to work for, you don't get millions of dollars, but
No.
they'll pay you something, and in return, you guarantee to work anywhere from 7 to 1, or even 1 year, or even 1 day if you do the deal right before Jubilee, or the Sabbath year. Well, anyway, it was a release, though. They always released their servants. You couldn't have Jewish slaves if you were a Jew. The best they could be is just workers for you. And that's how you're supposed to treat them too, as workers, not as slaves. Well, that practice in the Sabbath year aligns perfectly with this idea of Jubilee too. It ensured no one remained in bondage or separated from their loved ones, and no one got their lands taken away from them. So it's time of release. Another principle that God wanted it to be was a rest. Not only did you release, the land, give it back, you also did not work the land for those 2 years. And that took a lot of courage and faith and restraint. And it was very good for the land because it really got it a chance to recover, refill its nitrogen levels, or I'm not a farmer, but the things that happen when you let the land go fallow. I do know enough about it to know that it's good not to overwork the land. Next thing, and the final aspect of this Jubilee is restoration. And that was probably one of the more significant aspects of the Jubilee, is because it restored, let's drill some more down into restoring this property to the original owners. Doing that ensured that the land, which is the foundation of Israel's economy and just who they were, remained within the original families and tribes. Why is that important? Because when they go to the promised land, when they get there, God's going to divide that promised land into land for each tribe. And that was supposed to be that tribe's land forever until they got all exiled when they were sinned. But God did not want, let's say, someone from the tribe of Judah getting really rich and buying up all the land of the tribe of Benjamin, or the tribe of Ephraim, or the tribe of Manasseh, whatever. They wanted it to stay with the tribes. And so that's another thing this forced, because once you own that land, if the I don't know, the Duncan family owned a piece of property in the tribe of Judah, in the land of Judah, the Duncan family always owned that property. And everybody was a descendant, every Jew was a descendant of someone who originally owned property. So they kept that property. They kept it within the original tribes and families. Because I keep saying they own the land. None of them owned the land. The Lord owned the land. And they were just stewards, and he wanted them to stay put. Any land sale, therefore, was temporary, and its value depended on the number of years into the next Jubilee. That's another fascinating economic aspect of this. The land's, like I said, land's almost worthless the day before Jubilee, but it's very valuable 50 years before it. Since God's law required that they return it every 50 years, you could say that there were no purchases of land. They were all just leases. You could only lease some land from the original owners. Well, some nice things that fall out of that is that, like I said, it prevented a wealthy individual who got lucky in life, or for whatever reason, to grab the land from a family who maybe had some hard times, maybe because they were foolish, or maybe because a hurricane hit them, whatever, that something happened, and they couldn't keep that land forever. So it prevented the large estates. Back then, really your wealth was more the land you owned than other things. Another fact is that the people, by doing that, they were reminded that it's not their land. This land is God's land, as the title of this chapter says. And they were not to oppress each other, take advantage. Now, the prophet Isaiah, he took this idea of Jubilee, the year of Jubilee, and made it a picture of the Messianic kingdom. How did that work? Well, the Lord God, Jesus, would release and restore his people in that time. Jesus, in his sermon on the synagogue in Nazareth, applied this passage to himself, declaring the acceptable year of the Lord. So Luke 4:16-30. I'll read it very quickly here. I'm not going to read all of it, the part that's relevant. When he came to the village of Nazareth, his boyhood home, he went to the synagogue, he went as usual to the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read the scriptures. The scroll of Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. What a coincidence. With God, there are no coincidences. He unrolled that scroll and found the place where this was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. Now, the time of the Lord's favor is also is translated as the time to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. So that acceptable year of the Lord, that's another word for Jubilee, acceptable year of the Lord. And note how for Jesus, it's not, and for Isaiah, it wasn't just land and people set free. That would happen. The captives, it would also be that the captives would be released and that the blind will see. The oppressed will be set free. So in that, he declared himself as that Messiah. His message was a spiritual jubilee, offering salvation, freedom from sin, and restoration of broken lives. The year of Jubilee, this concept serves as a powerful illustration of the gospel. See, just as lenders forgave debts, just as owners released slaves during Jubilee, for us, Jesus offers freedom and forgiveness if we trust him. This Jubilee experience through Christ restores relationships, heals brokenness, and brings spiritual refreshment, renewal. Salvation through faith in Jesus Christ is truly a jubilee, a new beginning marked by freedom, restoration, and God's abundant blessings. Let's look now at the kinsman redeemer. Okay, here's the verses that make the book of Ruth make sense. Leviticus 25:25-55.
If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell some family land, then a close relative should buy it back for him. If there is no close relative to buy the land, but the person who sold it gets enough money to buy it back, he then has the right to redeem it from the one who bought it. The price of the land will be discounted according to the number of years until the next year of Jubilee. In this way, the original owner can then return to the land. But if the original owner cannot afford to buy back the land, it will remain with the new owner until the next year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, the land must be returned to the original owners so they can return to their family land. Anyone who sells a house inside a walled town has the right to buy it back for a full year after its sale. During the year, the seller retains the right to buy it back. But if it is not bought back within a year, the sale of the house within the walled town cannot be reversed. It will become the permanent property of the buyer. It will not be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. But the house in a village, a settlement without fortified walls, will be treated like property in the countryside. Such a house may be bought back at any time, and it must be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. The Levites always have the right to buy back a house they have sold within the towns allotted to them, and any property that is sold by the Levites, all houses within the Levitical towns, must be returned in the year of Jubilee. After all, the houses in the towns reserved for the Levites are the only property they own in all Israel. The open pasture land around the Levitical towns may never be sold. It is their permanent possession. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident and allow him to live with you. Do not charge interest or make a profit at his expense. Instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. Remember, do not charge interest on money you lend him or make a profit on food you sell him. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or as a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. At that time, he and his children will no longer be obligated to you, and they will return to their clans and go back to the land originally allotted to their ancestors. The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, so they must never be sold as slaves. Show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. However, you may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you. You may also purchase the children of temporary residents who live among you, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as a permanent inheritance. You may treat them as slaves, but you must never treat your fellow Israelites this way. Suppose a foreigner or temporary resident becomes rich while living among you. If any of your fellow Israelites fall into poverty and are forced to sell themselves to such a foreigner or to a member of his family, they still retain the right to be bought back even after they have been purchased. They may be bought back by a brother, an uncle, or a cousin. In fact, anyone from the extended family may buy them back. They may also redeem themselves if they have prospered. They will negotiate the price of their freedom with the person who bought them. The price will be based on the number of years from the time they were sold until the next year of Jubilee, whatever it would cost to hire a worker for that period of time. If many years still remain until the Jubilee, they will repay the proper portion of what they received when they sold themselves. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they will repay a small amount for their redemption. The foreigner must treat them as workers hired on a yearly basis. You must not allow a foreigner to treat any of your fellow Israelites harshly. If any Israelites have not been bought back by the time the year of Jubilee arrives, they and their children must be set free at that time. For the people of Israel belong to me. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Well, I can almost see Moses up there talking to God about this, and God laid down this idea of the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee, and Moses has kind of been thinking about it maybe. But what about this case? And what about that case? And it sounds like this is God and Moses going over specific cases to give a better feel for how this general law gets applied for, well, for the Levites, or for what is a house like the land, or is it different? You know, if it's in the city. So that's what a lot of this is about. And God clarifies all those things in these verses. So what we learn is that if a poor Jew had to sell himself for his property to survive, he didn't have to wait till the year of Jubilee to regain his freedom or land. Because a kinsman redeemer, someone related and willing to pay the price, could redeem him back or his property at any time. So I've got a lease for some property, 5-year lease on some land that's rich farmland, and I bought my farm equipment and everything, and I'm ready to go, and I need to have it at least 5 years to at least make a break even on buying all that upfront tractor and everything, equipment and the seeds and everything. And so I'm 2 years into the lease. Kinsman the Redeemer comes along and buys the land. He says, I want to farm it now. I guess you're out of luck. But it wouldn't be very nice for him to do that. No, it wasn't really a 5-year lease. I can redeem it at any time. And that would be written into the lease then and make the land, I guess, less valuable then. Well, anyway, let's look at the different situations here. The redemption of the land. If the landowner was too poor to buy back his land, as a near kinsman could redeem it for him. If the owner later acquired enough wealth, you know, the original owner who sold his land, he could buy it back himself. The price depended on the years remaining to the year of Jubilee. If no kinsman was available and the owner couldn't afford to redeem it, well, he had to wait till Jubilee year hit, and then he got his land back. Now, if he's 70 when he sold the land, and it's 20 years to the next Jubilee, and he doesn't live, well, let's say he's 50, and it's 20, and he's 90, and it's 40 years till the next Jubilee. He's probably not going to live to 130. Although Moses did. I'm trying to come up with a good example where he might not ever see his land back, but I'm sure it could happen just because of where he was born relative to the year of Jubilee. Anyway, you can see the idea there. Now let's look at the redemption of houses. Well, houses were treated quite differently depending on if they were in walled cities or if they were out in the country. If they were in a walled city, they were more valuable because, you know, the protection they offered. Usually housing in a city, even today, is more costly than one out in the country. So if the original owner, the housing worked differently. The original owner only had 1 year to redeem that house. If he didn't do that, it was not his house ever again. He lost his house there. He didn't lose his land for the land he had, but the house in the city, nope, that was gone. Even after a year of Jubilee, nothing got him that house back. However, if the house was in the village, like I said, in an unwalled village, then he could treat it just like land. Okay, that's how God decided that one. Levites. Well, what about these folks? They've got a problem because they don't have any land. Now, they were not allocated any land originally, so they might be able to lease land from somebody else, but then they're always going to be giving it back. They tended to live in the cities and farm around the cities. So if they sold their houses, it was treated differently. Their houses were like their land. They never got to lose, they never lost their house. If they didn't get redeemed, they would revert back to them automatically during the year of Jubilee. So I guess that means a house owned by a Levite would be inherently less valuable than a house not owned by a Levite because of that rule. Because if I'm someone from the tribe of Judah and I own a house in the city, I can sell it to you, and you've got 1 year of being a little worried somebody going to get it back. After that, it's yours. So that'd be pretty valuable. A house owned by a Levite a year before the year of Jubilee, or wouldn't have, or even the Sabbath year, wouldn't be very valuable because he'd get it back. The purpose of that was so the Levites always had a place to live. You couldn't do something like foolish, like sell the only place they have to live, or flip the coin so that someone couldn't take advantage of it. Levi is not so smart and steal the land from him. Okay, and then now let's look at redemption of the poor, and that's its own little. There are a lot of special cases. There are 3 scenarios Moses talked about in this section. Let's say you have a bankrupt brother. If a fellow Jew became bankrupt, other Israelites were commanded to assist him with interest-free loans. Jews were forbidden from charging interest to one another, but they could charge to the Gentiles. Giving loans to the poor was an act of faith, since all debts were going to disappear, right? In the year of Jubilee, the early church embraced this principle, caring for the needy among them. It was like all for one, one for all. Let's look at a poor Jew becoming a servant. If he had to sell himself to survive, he was to be treated as a hired worker, not as a slave. Israelites were to treat their slaves kindly, remembering them as they had once, because they had once been slaves in Egypt. Jewish servants were free after 6 years or earlier if a Jubilee came along. I haven't figured out how that could happen yet, since it always immediately follows a Sabbath year. Need to think maybe some more. Maybe there is a scenario. Jews could own Gentile slaves. Okay. This is sticky. Jews could own the Gentile slaves. God said you can own slaves who were permanent property unless redeemed. Well, of course, they misused this passage of the Bible during the Civil War to justify slavery. You know God doesn't like slavery. I know God doesn't like slavery. God's law then, the purpose of God saying that back then was not to condone slavery. It was to make it, to encapsulate it so people didn't abuse it, didn't abuse their slaves. And this is one case where it's not mentioned very often in the Bible. I think the Bible's whispering, it's okay to have slaves. And it's really shouting all other places, love your brother, love your neighbor as yourself. And the bigger message coming out of the Bible is you shouldn't have slaves. Okay. I mean, even in the New Testament days, they were still, the Bible didn't say anything against slavery. So I have trouble with Wiersbe's justification. We're out of time, but maybe we'll talk about that next week a little bit about slavery was the reason that God didn't put it into the Bible that slavery is wrong is because if the church had campaigned against slavery in the Roman Empire, those in power would have seen it as a political movement, and this would have slowed the spread of the gospel. Well, sounds to me like that's argument that Wiersbe made there is that the end justifies the means. Let's move on because I'm past time, but let's look at now a Jew enslaved by a Gentile. Okay, so a Jew enslaved by a Gentile. If that Gentile lived in the land of Israel, then that was not possible. A Jew couldn't be a slave. He would be an indentured servant for up to 7 years, and that was it. I mean, I'm sorry, up until the year of Jubilee. It didn't revert every 7 years. So we've got the story of Ruth and Boaz. That's an example of the kinsman redeemer law. Boaz was able to redeem Ruth and her inheritance, and he ended up marrying her. That story, the cool thing about that story of Ruth and Boaz is it points to Jesus Christ, because we're his bride. He became our near kinsman, taking on human flesh and paying the ultimate price for our redemption. Jesus was the only one qualified and willing to redeem us. And in doing so, he made us part of his inheritance. Like I said earlier, their greed and sin meant that they didn't obey God's commands here, as well as not obeying a lot of other commands, like having idols and things. And it led to them, the Jews, exploiting their own poor and ruining their own land and their economy. You know, Isaiah, Amos, the other prophets condemned the rich for oppressing the poor, stealing their land, and corrupting this legal system. But God heard the cries of the oppressed eventually and brought judgment on Israel. In the end, they were exiled. God cares deeply about how his people use resources and treat one another economically. Both ecological and economic justice matter. He loves his world. He doesn't want us destroying his world. He's going to judge those who exploit it. He's going to judge those who exploit fellow humans. The Church of Jesus Christ thrived under various political and financial systems, and still does, but we always have to stand for the rights of the poor and the oppressed. The Bible shouts that. I'm sorry. British writer Samuel Johnson's words remain true, which is that a decent provision for the poor is a true test of civilization. It's all through the scripture too, where God hears the cries of the afflicted and defends the fatherless and the oppressed. To summarize, this chapter of Leviticus provided us an analysis of the Sabbath year of Jubilee. Every 7th year, the land was to rest. Every 50th year, God required the Jews to restore property and people. And in the big picture, that so clearly emphasized God's provision, his fairness, and importance he put on justice. He wanted to make sure that no one remained permanently enslaved or impoverished. They were all his people. You don't own anybody. God owns them. Next week, we're going to do chapter 26 of Leviticus. And we're going to go through, 26 and 27. Now, 26 outlines the blessings for obedience to God's commands and the consequences for disobedience. And it emphasizes how important the covenant is, and how whether it's the old covenant for them or the new covenant for us, to be faithful to it. And then Leviticus 27 will also cover, and that's got instructions on how to make vows, dedicating people, maybe like you do a vow for God, dedicate animals, and dedicate property. And then rules for redeeming those, excuse me, I'm sorry, and rules for redeeming these dedications that you make, you redeem them. That'd be an interesting chapter there too. Sorry, we went a little long, but at this point, I will stop sharing the screen and give you a chance to comment.
Anything you want to say, dear?
Still needs to be rested.
Amen. Land still needs to be rested.
Yeah.
Overgrazing. It doesn't have
No,
course, that's why drought is so bad, it's just, you know,
yes,
and we need rain now too, by the way.
we need rain. Yes, at
Mhm.
least down here in Texas, we're suffering again.
Sure do.
Um, Something that I didn't bring out too much, but will now is that year Jubilee and then the Sabbath year. It not only it wasn't just resting the land. It's like everybody didn't do much work that year. What was their main occupation? They were people who tilled the land. I guess they transitioned from farmers to hunter gatherers for a year. Did some very different, they probably enjoyed it, that kind of life for you to take a break and do something different for a while. Sabbatical, that's, I never got a sabbatical. My older brother Art, he'd get one every few years
Mhm. She was a teacher,
because he was a teacher.
professor.
And I've worked with people, in my company, we would work with almost every high tech company there was. And the more successful ones like Intel, those guys got a sabbatical.
Wow.
Yeah, they got to take off a year, got paid for it. I don't know how they
Goodness.
could swing it, but yeah.
Mhm.
Well, it wasn't a year, it was about 3 months, I
Mhm.
think.
That's nice.
Still very nice.
Mhm.
Woman's work is never done, so.
That's
Women's work, yeah.
true, Jane.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Man works from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. I've always said this, if you look around, if you turn your head, you're gonna see something that needs to be done, so just don't turn.
Oh. We have to put our blinders on Sunday.
Yeah. Thank you all, I'm gonna call old Philip and talk to her.
Oh, good,
Good.
okay.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Jeannie.
Try to cheer her up.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks.
And thank you for trying to get her, maybe those other times she had
Yes.
told me she would like to, is why I told you.
Mhm. Well,
Okay.
we sure would love to have her.
But she doesn't